Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Berman from DevOps.com and the host of the Cyber Hero Adventures show. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to another great DevOps.com webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. Today we have Kendall Miller, the president of Fairwinds. We're going to learn about how to optimize your Kubernetes initiatives and where to turn to for help. But before we get to today's presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. We use the GoToWebinar system. So for many of you, you'll see the control panel. Please take a moment to click on the questions icon and the little downward arrow. Our guests will be answering questions throughout the presentation. This webinar is designed to be highly interactive with our great speakers. By the way, Ivan, hi also. We welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions in real time, and we'll get to as many as possible. If we can't get to your question, don't worry. We'll email you the replies to you shortly. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and the slides will be available to you on demand at devops.com in a couple of hours. Additionally, we have a giveaway of 4 $25 Amazon gift cards at the end of today's webinar, so stay tuned to see if you're one of today's lucky winners. And now, a special thank you to our sponsors for today's webinar. Let's get started. Kendall and Ivan, take it away.
All right, thank you, Gary. So welcome everyone. This is 3 Kubernetes problems and 3 solutions. We'll go ahead and dive right in. First of all, by way of introduction, my name is Kendall Miller. I'm president at a company called Fairwinds. We'll get to what Fairwinds does in just a second, but I've been at this company for a long time, about 5 years, doing all kinds of things from sales and operations to engineering leadership. I've held a lot of different roles in the company and have been tuned into the Kubernetes world for a long time and excited to be here with you. And Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ivan Fetch. I'm a site reliability engineer and more recently switched into a solutions architect role with Fairwinds. I've been with the company for a little bit over 2 years, and thank you all for joining today.
All right, so real quick at a high level, why we're the ones talking to you today about this is we work at this company called Fairwinds, and Fairwinds has been in business about 5.5 years, exclusively focused on Kubernetes for about 4 of those years, 4.5 of those years, somewhere in there. Today, we call ourselves the Kubernetes Enablement Company. We have a combination of software, open source, and services that meet people anywhere in their Kubernetes journey. So our bread and butter as a company has for a long time been services offering we call cluster ops. We'll build and maintain Kubernetes infrastructure for people. So part of the reason Ivan and I are here talking about this today is we have built and run Kubernetes clusters at scale in production for lots and lots of companies for a number of years. There's a lot of people out there who have kicked the tires on Kubernetes, but at Fairwinds, we've been doing this in production for brands you've heard of for a very long time. So that's part of why we're here. That's our core offering, is that service. We also have a bunch of open source in this space because we operate so many clusters at scale for so many different clients. We're often running into things and saying, hey, this is a macro problem that everyone has. Let's go write an open source tool to solve that. And then finally, we do have software that's a SaaS tool for helping you know if you're running your Kubernetes clusters or the things that you're running in your Kubernetes clusters are configured securely, reliably, and efficiently. It's my belief everybody would be using Kubernetes if they believe they could get those 3 things right. Most people are afraid of Kubernetes because they're afraid they'll get one of those things wrong. It's a new paradigm and different and complicated. And if you want help with that, we have software there. So that's who Fairwinds is. And Ivan and I are here as a result of being in the space for a while. And let's go ahead and dive in. Please do ask questions as we go along. There is the question bar, as Gary mentioned, on the side. I will try to pay attention to that throughout. And then we'll have some time for question and answer at the end for the things we didn't get to. Today's agenda, the introduction that we just got through. We'll start with problem 1, the difficulty of getting Kubernetes configuration right. Problem 2, finding the necessary add-ons above and beyond basic Kubernetes. And then problem 3, where do you go to get help? And then at the end, we have a couple recommendations and next steps, and we'll leave some time for question and answer. So for problem one, getting Kubernetes configuration right, we're going to start with a poll to sort of take a look at where folks are in the Kubernetes journey. If you can pull that up for me, Jade. And go ahead and take a second and respond to this so that we have some feeling for where the audience is. We have about 25% of you have voted. Rolling in faster, keep clicking those buttons. Give you about 10 more seconds and then we'll show the results. All right, so we have about 50% of the audience has voted, and here's the results. So about 41% of you are right at the beginning, learning about Kubernetes and containers. 32% have spun up a test cluster. 18% have started using it in pre-production, and only 9% are using it in production. So this is a little bit what we'd expect. I think that this shows a little bit of the macro environment around Kubernetes right now. That there's not a whole lot of people who have gotten to a point where they feel comfortable running it in production yet. And we're going to talk today about some of why that is and some of what to do about that. Any thoughts on those results before I dive in, Ivan?
No, it looks good. Let's keep going.
Okay. So first up, getting Kubernetes configuration right. So part of the reason, the first problem is there's a lot of new things in Kubernetes because it is a new paradigm that most people are not used to. The same way that I regularly liken it to a move from Windows to Linux. If you're unfamiliar with Linux, getting everything set up with Linux is really quite complicated. Once you're familiar with it, it's easy to get right, but that paradigm shift is complicated. And so getting that configuration right is really difficult. And it starts with very simple questions. So for example, where are you putting your clusters? And Ivan, you want to talk a little bit at a high level about all the different options there?
Yeah, so where you're putting your clusters is going to typically be in two broad categories of either you're living in cloud or you're living in some on-prem data centers somewhere. And there's, of course, multiple cloud environments that also differentiate some of how the configuration of your clusters happens. You've got Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google, Oracle clouds, etc. There's other clouds out there as well. And the differences that you're going to see in cloud are going to have to do with how they expose configuration options. That's going to be Amazon EKS, Google GKE, that kind of thing. Cloud is going to also provide you some nice provisioning options, such as when you have a load balancer service in your Kubernetes cluster, the cloud provisioner that's also installed as part of Kubernetes will help you to provision load balancers automatically. If you're running Kubernetes in a data center, you're going to have to install some additional add-ons that might be provided by the provider of your load balancer to help you connect those things in Kubernetes. So on-prem Kube, there's a little more heavy lifting that you might have to do to tie things together that tend to come, quote unquote, out of the box with cloud provisioners that come along with Kubernetes running in cloud.
Well, and I have to say, Ivan, you started with, you listed Amazon, Google, Azure, and then you said, and Oracle and others. I was really surprised you didn't put Oracle into the other box, but we can agree to disagree on that one. But the other option is you can spin Kubernetes clusters yourself on top of whatever the compute engine is, EC2 or Google Compute or whatever, right? And so you can both leverage the managed offering, or you can spin your own clusters in the cloud as well, and that just adds to all the other complexity. But whether you're doing that or not, even just talk at a high level, like how do we think about the default for availability zones? Do we build it in one availability zone in one particular cloud in one region? Do we spread that out? How do you think about that?
Yeah, we want to span availability zones. So think of availability zones like essentially a failure domain from a data center perspective. That might be equivalent to an area where you've got a different level of redundancy for power, cooling, and that kind of thing. So for cloud, we want to span availability zones both in the control plane, which is the management layer of Kubernetes, as well as for the quote unquote worker nodes where your application workloads actually run inside Kubernetes. Pods, which is essentially your containers running in Kubernetes, can be topology aware. So that means that you can, depending on the needs of your workloads, have your containers that scale up for your application either stay away from one another, avoid one another, or glom together in the same availability zone, which you might want to do to avoid costs of data transfer between availability zones. So depending on your use case there. But the thing that is important from the Kubernetes configuration perspective is make your clusters span preferably 3 availability zones in cloud. And if you're in a data center, similarly, you want to try to have your clusters, your nodes, and your control plane span as much quote unquote availability zone as you can.
Yeah, so I mean, 3 being a good default to maybe aim for, as opposed to just 1, just 2, or 12. And that's sort of the default that we would probably suggest to clients. There may be times where you have different things, and that's the whole thing about this. Getting Kubernetes configuration right is just a huge series of trade-offs, and there's some obvious things that are long-time cloud best practices that carry over into Kubernetes, but there's a million different things there. So then once you've you've stood up your Kubernetes cluster, your first cluster, I guess the next question is one cluster enough, Ivan? And then how are you going to divide up namespaces? Like, what does the logical breakdown in that look like as a default? Or maybe even give me an example if there can't be a default.
Yeah, this is a big it depends kind of hand wavy conversation as well. But generally, we like to see at least 2 clusters. So one of them is where everything production goes, and sometimes production-like things that might be exposure of new features of an application to certain customer bases, and so essentially things that are still close to production. And then the second cluster is a pre-prod cluster where test and staging workloads can go, as well as ephemeral or branch-based deploys. What other platforms tend to call review apps, those kind of things can go there. As far as the cluster versus namespace thing, namespaces are really a logical separation that can reflect whatever makes the most sense to your organization. So if you have, project or team-based or other access-based factors that you want to split up your deploys of an application, which can include deploying an application multiple times for testing and QA and so on, you can design your namespaces however you like. In and of themselves, namespaces aren't really much of a literal boundary, although you can attach other things to namespaces. So you can leverage namespaces as a sort of virtual container, if you will, and you can attach role-based access control. So who has what kind of permission in the cluster. You can also, if you're using network policies to essentially create firewall rules inside Kubernetes, you can also attach those to namespaces. So there is an advantage that I'll end with here to having fewer clusters, which is that Kubernetes is going to quote unquote bin pack your containers on Kubernetes nodes as best it can. So if you've got a bunch of smaller clusters, you might waste more compute power than if you had fewer clusters and you're using namespaces or other mechanisms to isolate your workloads. Then you're gonna make better use of your nodes.
Yeah, so I mean, there's just so much configuration here, and even whether you're going to run your data inside the cluster or not is a big question people regularly ask, and we generally encourage you not to run long-lasting data in the cluster. But then there's all the things around how are you going to monitor and monitor well. There's just a million different things that are difficult to get right with configuration. So that's the problem. As for solutions, Ivan, what are some tools that you can think of in this space that make some of that easier? I mean, obviously, we're going to get to at the end who to hire and when to hire, internal, external, those kinds of help. for this and what the trade-offs are in those. But in addition to people, are there tools that help get some of this configuration right?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to add-ons, I think, in a little bit. You know, as far as tools to help you get your configuration right, I would say, you know, you want to use something in the, you know, to help you represent your infrastructure as code. So there are a lot of choices here that use different languages to represent your infrastructure. Terraform is one big example of that. So that you're representing not only the configuration of your Kubernetes cluster, but also the prerequisites of that cluster. So if you're in cloud, your VPC, your networks, if you're doing network address translation for your nodes, then you know that layer can be in there as well. You can continue to use that for things that your applications require as well, like you know cloud hosted, cloud managed databases. To Kendall's point about having you know state live in Kubernetes, it's certainly possible. It's not something that we tend to recommend, but especially if it's your first foray into Kubernetes, we strongly prefer using managed cloud services like for your databases and things like Redis and so on and so forth. So you can manage all that stuff using infrastructure as code with a tool like Terraform.
Yeah, and I would add there's tools out there like Sonobuoy is a tool that you know will tell you if you've built your clusters in a conformant way. Then Fairwinds, we have you know the SaaS tool that I mentioned, Fairwinds Insights, available on our website. There's a free trial you can go kick the tires and see, and that's going to tell you, do you have misconfiguration that's going to lead to security problems? Are you deploying things that you shouldn't be deploying into it, et cetera? And there's even some policy enforcement there to help you get configuration right. You can write your own configuration, or you can use a lot of the out-of-the-box checks. So those are some places to go. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Problem 2, finding the necessary add-ons above and beyond Kubernetes itself. So just starting with Kubernetes itself, anybody can click a button, get Kubernetes cluster, especially in a managed cloud provider. Then you have to figure out how many clusters you want, how are you going to configure that? We've covered that, but then there's also all the additional things you're going to need as add-ons to get to production ready. And that's difficult to know. What are those add-ons? How do we configure those, et cetera? We'll get to that in just a second. Pulling up the second poll, so here we go. What apprehensions do you or your team have about using add-ons like these in your clusters? So these are the add-ons above and beyond just plain Kubernetes. So if you can go ahead and vote, we'll look at this. The options are desire for more comprehensive documentation. We would like support for and if we get stuck. Automating management like DNS or certificates feels scary, or all of the above. We got about a quarter of you voted thus far. Keep going. Give it a little bit longer. 10 more seconds and we'll close this. And closing now. Here's the results. So 18% of you said a desire for more comprehensive documentation around the add-ons. That makes sense. There's a lot out there. Even knowing which add-ons to use is really hard. We would like support if and when we get stuck. I hear that. Some of the add-ons are the kinds of add-ons that are just open source and aren't backed by support anywhere. Some of them are third-party, you know, supported by someone, and I can understand the need to be able to pick up the phone if something goes wrong. Automating management like DNS or certificates feels scary. That's interesting that that's only 11%. I feel like I run into a lot of people in the wild who do not have automation for certificates, those kinds of things. And then 54% of you said all of the above. So I guess maybe that's part of the answer. Okay, we can wrap that up and dive in.
It's all matched together in there somewhere.
Yeah. It's all matched together in there somewhere. I mean, everything's scary is the answer, right, Ivan? I get that. So finding the necessary add-ons above and beyond Kubernetes. So we've got a bunch of things listed here: external DNS, cert manager. Ivan, you want to dive in and talk about a few of these different things and why they're essential for getting to a production grade cluster?
Yeah, sure thing. So in no particular order, these are all things that we find to be a must-have on top of Kubernetes to really help you get toward the experience that you are going to want to have. Metrics server is the one I'll talk about a little bit initially. So that's going to give you metrics not only for your nodes, but also for the pods or containers that are running in your cluster. That's a must-have in order to both help you scale your applications horizontally. So if you're going to use an HPA to scale your apps, there need to be some kind of metrics, and typically the starter metrics that folks will use is either CPU or memory. Not always the best metrics to scale on necessarily. You want to scale on a metric that's most applicable, directly applicable to what your application needs. Maybe instead you might use a queue that application processes. But metric server is a must-have to help you start getting those base level stats out of your cluster. Cluster autoscaler, hugely important. So in order to have a new node be added to your cluster on demand, which using cloud, it's going to spin up a new EC2 instance or Google Compute, and that's going to join your Kubernetes cluster so that a previously unschedulable workload pod can now be scheduled on that new node. Cluster autoscaler is what makes that happen. So that's hugely important. External DNS is going to let you configure certain DNS zones to have records added automatically. So when you're configuring a load balancer service, or more likely an ingress in your cluster, and you define some host names to go along with that, those can just be added to DNS automatically. That's hugely helpful. And then going along with that, Cert Manager is something that can be used to manage certificates. You can do kind of a private certificate authority in your cluster using that, but you can also leverage Let's Encrypt, and Cert Manager will regularly renew those certificates for you before they get to that 90-day expiration period. So, there's a few other things on here. I don't know that I could go on and on and on, but in the interest of time, there's also ingress controller. That's a necessary component to let ingresses work in Kubernetes. Ingresses are a Kubernetes object, but you have to have an ingress controller to actually fulfill that. RBAC Manager is a tool that we make that is very, very helpful. It's free, it's open source, so you should definitely check that out. And that allows you to ease managing role-based access control. So what kind of permissions do different users or groups of users have in Kubernetes? Goldilocks and Polaris are two more open source offerings that I'll mention here that are free that you all should check out. Goldilocks helps you by observing the resource utilization of your pods and recommending what you maybe should change those to. That's a very, very common problem. And then Polaris helps you do some of that checking that Kendall also referenced earlier in your cluster in terms of practices that might not be such good practices from a security standpoint. For example, you can also run Polaris in a mode that it will deny resources being added to your cluster that violate your configuration. So I've just rattled somewhat quickly through some highlights on a lot of these add-ons, and it maybe feels and sounds like a lot, but these are all going to really send your Kubernetes experience into the next level, and they're highly recommended.
Yeah, and what we have listed here is, some of the basics that you really need in order to get to comfort level running production. So can you manage a Kubernetes cluster without using role-based access control? Yes. The problems you're going to have, and we've seen happen in real life, is, we've had a client that gave everybody the same permissions, and then they had an engineer leave the company, and they had to tear down all their clusters and stand them back up because they didn't have a way to deny that engineer access to the production environment after they left. So by using role-based access control, they can assign certain roles to people, change those roles, et cetera, and you don't have to tear down your entire infrastructure when somebody leaves the company. So that it may sound like a nice to have, it ends up being a must have if you're doing things wrong. And there's a lot there. If you want to know what are the necessary add-ons above and beyond Kubernetes, you can look at this. Fairwinds also has a package of open source offerings called Fairwinds Elements, and you can check that out on our website and our GitHub. It lists every single project. They are all open source, and they are all the things that you need to do to get to production. And for the 18% of you plus those of you in the 54% that selected all of the above that would like more support if and when you have problems. We do offer support behind all of those tools, some of which we've built, some of which are third party as well. So if you want help getting support around the add-ons, because that's hard too, we also offer that. But these are some of the places to get started. So finally, and we're going to spend a good bit of time here, where do you go to get help when you're running into some of these problems? So we also have a poll here as well, the third and final poll, if you want to bring that up. What are your biggest challenges to deploying Kubernetes? Select one of the following. So we've got getting to production, the reliability or availability of kube-hosted applications, assigning appropriate minimal permissions to accessing Kubernetes, branch-based or temporary application deployments, and then finally something not listed here, I'll post in the Q&A section, which we have had a few questions come in, so I will share a few things here as we go. And let's see, on that, we've got about 35% of you have voted. Let's see, click a few more of you, click these buttons and we'll wrap the poll up. 10 more seconds. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that. All right, so looks like getting to production is 29% of you has said that's the biggest challenge. That's the largest percent. 24% have the reliability or availability of kube-hosted applications. 21% said assigning appropriate or minimal positions to accessing Kubernetes. And 21% said branch-based or temporary application deployments. And 6 of you said something else. So we'll get to those in the Q&A section. But thanks for answering that. I'm trying to think if there's anything that, you know, again, for assigning the correct permissions, take a look at RBAC Manager. That will make that simplified. For branch-based or temporary application deployments, there's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of SaaS tools out there that address this. One of our open source tools is called Rocket Scripts that handles the entire deployment lifecycle and can help ease some of that. It's not a full-fledged solution for that. It works in conjunction with your CI tool. As for getting to production, we're going to address some of that for where to get help in just a second.
Also,
so
quickly before we move on, RBAC Manager also helps a bit with the ephemeral or branch-based deploys, in that if you are going to create a namespace on the fly for that deploy, if you can assign a label to that namespace when you create it, you can have RBAC Manager configured to assign permissions to any namespaces that may show up with that label. So that's a really, really nice way of not having to know what the names of all the namespaces are going to be, but having something that's running all the time in your cluster, in this case, RBAC Manager, watching, and when it sees a namespace with this label appear, it's going to create whatever cluster role bindings or role bindings in that namespace. I should say role bindings that could attach to cluster roles or to roles in that namespace for you. So that's a really nice way of giving a group of developers a different level of access to those ephemeral deploys. So check out RBAC Manager for that as well.
Sure. We've got a couple questions that have come in. I'll get to those in the Q&A section in just a second, but let's dive into where do you go to get help. So we've got 3 options here, when to hire internally, when to hire consulting services, and then when to hire managed services. So I'll get started with some of this, and then Ivan, you know, feel free to interrupt me, and I'll yield to you on some of this as well. So there's advantages and disadvantages to all of these, and when to hire internally. So I'll say, you know, Fairwinds has been around for a while, like I said, doing Kubernetes really since it was about 1.1, which was a little bit early in the Kubernetes world. There weren't a lot of people running Kubernetes in production at that point. And it was really difficult to find people that knew Kubernetes to hire internally. That was a big part of the reason why people hired us. Another thing is that what's interesting about infrastructure, and Kubernetes is a piece of that, is for most companies, infrastructure is not their core competency. Most companies do not make money because of the infrastructure that they have. The infrastructure enables that, and they need good infrastructure. But having the world's best infrastructure is not essential for you until really your Netflix scale. If your company is Netflix, you need to have the world's best infrastructure people, because you are solving infrastructure problems that nobody else on the planet has. It has to be core to what you do. But for almost everyone else, you're really asking people to go and reinvent the wheel. And so there's a lot of advantages to be had to not hire people internally and build a huge team that does this. So one of the issues with hiring internally is, there's a sliding scale of quality and success depending on experience. And one of the ways we're going to talk about this is think about a bathroom remodel. So consulting service is hiring a contractor to come in and build out your bathroom, right? Hiring internally is kind of deciding to do the project yourself. A managed service is asking someone like an HOA to both build it and maintain it for you for the long term. Make sure your plumbing doesn't go wrong. And so that's, in that analogy, when it comes to hiring internally, you're a little bit saying, how good of a job can I do on this? And maybe you can go, maybe you have somebody in your family who really knows this. Maybe you have somebody in your family who's done a tremendous amount of bathroom remodels, or in this case, has significantly built out lots of production-ready Kubernetes infrastructures. And so you trust that person because they've seen a lot of things and learned a lot of the difficult things the hard way. But you probably don't have a ton of time to give to it because it's probably not your core competency to be remodeling your own bathroom. You probably make money a different way, so it's going to have to happen on the weekends. It's going to be a little bit of a side project. And there's going to be pieces you're really good at, like maybe you're really great at laying the tile, but you're pretty bad at the electrical pieces or the plumbing. And that could really affect how successful you are in remodeling your bathroom. It's also going to affect the decisions you make. You might be like, well, I'd really like a skylight, but I know how to do everything else and I don't know how to do a skylight, right? And so it limits what you end up putting in. And that's, same thing in Kubernetes. It's limiting to you on what you're going to build because you're trusting that you have enough knowledge in-house to make that happen. Or you're able to hire someone that has enough knowledge to make that happen. What am I missing here, Evan?
You really filled in a lot of it really, really well. A few sort of comments that maybe bridge a few of these pieces together, is that that your example of tile versus electrical and this bathroom analog that we're using, I think is interesting because often you might be okay with doing it yourself and okay with how it looks, right? I don't like my toilet to be wobbly and the grout work to be kind of something that I might see every day and be irritated about. And so even though I might be able to learn and do something on my own, I might not like having to live with it, which is the analog to, is that going to be acceptable for your business, essentially? So you could use your energy to solve next level problems instead in your business, whether that is expanding your operations into other regions, other data centers, or simply putting that effort into application development and so on and so forth. We often see different levels of professional services or managed services being used as an on-ramp to companies learning more internally and eventually, quote unquote, graduating from having companies like ourselves as a resource. And that's great because you get the safety net, you get this, what I often call fast track to heading in a correct path faster, get me closer to the solution in less amount of time, and help build it for me as well. And then you're learning at the same time. The last piece I'll add here is around the potential for distracting against your core competency piece. I hear often that if our business is going to rely on Kubernetes, we want to be able to know and learn all the things. And that can absolutely make sense. But I think that there's a flip side to that, which is that there's a lot of things that we all rely on that we don't necessarily understand or become experts at. So I think the key thing to consider in all of this is that what is your time frame? What are your business goals and things that you need to accomplish along with Kubernetes being one of those projects, because if you're going to distract against your core competency, then you might be causing some pain to your business, versus bringing one of these combinations of professional services or managed services in is going to help you with your project timing, help you be ahead of schedule. And that's what we like to see, right? Helping people focus on the thing that they're already awesome at and continuing to succeed, and then getting out of the way when it's time.
Yeah. Well, and I would liken that to, before we move on to consulting, I'll add more to that, because it's not your core competency, and because somebody in-house went and built this whole thing, what happens is, you were there when they were installing the handles on the shower heads or something, right? And you saw that you accidentally stripped that while you were the device that screws on while you were doing it. And so every time you turn on the shower, you have to fiddle with it a little bit. You know exactly how to fiddle with it because you're the one that installed it. But the problem is it needs to be fiddled with every single time. And eventually the person who lives in your house that installed that and understands how to fiddle with it goes off to college or whatever it is, changes jobs, and now you have a fiddly thing that you don't know how to fix, and you're pretty sure you know how to fiddle with it, but you don't understand what's going on underneath, and that gets really complicated. So it's the same thing with an internal hire. You end up with a lot of weird jagged edges that you're comfortable with because they're your jagged edges, and then that engineer quits or gets a different job, and life gets a lot more complicated. So there's some advantages to having some outside help. And you can also do this in combination.
The process can create technical debt.
Yeah, and there's also you can do this in combination. You might be really good at the tiling and the grouting and hire somebody to come in and do the electrical. So it's the same thing on your infrastructure. It might be you're really comfortable managing your database, but you really need to hire someone to come in and help you with Kubernetes. So let's talk about consulting services. Where does consulting services fit in this, Adam? We've alluded to it a little bit, but.
Sorry, you cut out a little bit there. Did you say advantages?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just talk to us about what consulting services look like in this analogy, in the bathroom analogy.
Yeah, so consulting services I see a little bit more as I want a little bit of advice, but mostly I want work to be done. And I might drive that work a little bit more myself with some preference. And I may or may not get good long-term results or things that hold up well over time with consulting. Now that's a very broad, sweeping, somewhat subjective sort of way to say that. So before all the consulting people get mad, of course there's varying degrees of all of those things, but generally speaking, consulting tends to be shorter lived. And sometimes that's the original intent anyways, and then it goes long. So I see consulting as kind of work for hire necessarily, but much less management, right? Longer term.
Yeah, and the advantage of a consulting service is you can bring in an expert where all they do is bathroom remodels. You can say, I want a skylight, I want 4 shower heads, I want toilets that stack on top of each other. You can ask for the most complicated thing in the world, and because all these people do is bathroom remodels, they're going to be good at it. It's the same with Kubernetes. You can ask somebody to come and install the biggest, hairiest, most interesting thing, and you can probably find someone with that expertise who has done it a whole bunch of times and can do it right. Hopefully right. That's the other problem is a consultant is going to come in and build you something that looks really good, but you don't know if it actually leaks or if it's going to last long term, or they installed a really cool project because they wanted to try it for the first time and they thought, I'll try it out here. I've never laid glass tile. I'm going to try it at your house because I'm getting paid to do it, right? That's one of the risks there, and they are often unopinionated, so you can tell them exactly what to do. And that has some advantages to it and some disadvantages as well. So finally, on the managed service side, that's where Fairwinds sits, and we'll talk about this for a minute and then wrap up and get to questions. But the nice thing about a managed service, and think of an HOA, building out the bathroom, but really wanting the plumbing to last, because if a pipe breaks, it's their responsibility to come in and fix it. So the better it's built the first time, the faster it's built very well, the better long-term it's going to work out for the people who have to manage it. And so it's the same thing for us with Kubernetes versus a consulting service with Kubernetes. And again, not to bash the consulting services, some of them out there are really wonderful about it, but as a managed service company, we are heavily incentivized to be with you for the long term. And if you say, hey, I really want to install this thing in my cluster, and we know that's a terrible idea, there's a lot of, well, we can help you with that, but here's why it's a bad idea. And we don't want to have to manage that because we know it's going to go wrong and our incentives line up with yours. So think of, a contractor that comes in and says, you say to the contractor, I really want to install this kind of drain. Well, if it's a contractor, he doesn't care. He installs that drain and he leaves. If you have a managed service that's responsible for it, they're going to say, I don't want to install that kind of drain. Those drains always leak after 6 months. That's a terrible idea. So they're going to come in and they're going to be opinionated where the contractor is not going to be. It's going to be based on experience, and your incentives are going to align for the long term, which is one of the advantages there. Anything I missed there, Ivan?
No, not really. I would just add on the sort of contractor analog that I think a lot of contractor type relationships also that are, technical relationships that we're having these analogies for, they fade into managed services like situations. So I think there are plenty of consultants and plenty of contractor type things that are awesome quality, and that part of the basis for that is that they're thinking about this from the get-go a little more like a managed services perspective, even if the relationship is starting out more from a consultancy. I think it's about the long-term aspects of the relationship that make the difference here, right? Is that when we're working with customers from a managed services perspective, we're really looking at those long-term best interests, really always, because that's how and who we are. But I think that's the differentiator.
Yeah. Okay, so next steps, if you want to learn more about this, we have a white paper, Closing the Gap of Kubernetes Services. You can go check that out on our website, fairwinds.com, click on resources. This will help you walk through what are some of the things that you need to get to production ready. How can you get configuration right? Where do you look for help? This will help address all of those things. And there's also, I will share, I think I shared in one of the questions, the link to Fairwinds Elements, which is our opinionated, group of tools around add-ons. We also have our SaaS product, as I mentioned, Fairwinds Insights, that will help you run Kubernetes with confidence, securely, reliably, efficiently, has policy enforcement tooling there. But that's who we are. Thanks. That's the bulk of the presentation. And now we'll get to some Q&A. So Firsty Last said, thanks a lot. I really like that. So I want to say, no, thank you, Firsty. Next, one of the questions here says, how about security? Do you see enterprises still considering it, although especially it's complicated with a new technology like Kubernetes? So are people thinking about security, Ivan?
Oh, yes. Kubernetes being more of a distributed system than, perhaps running your applications across a handful of EC2 instances or something like that, it certainly changes, stretches out the security landscape. So security is very much part of things. The Insights software that Kendall has mentioned in the past has a lot of good recommendations that you can see around how are pods being configured to run in your Kubernetes cluster from a security vantage point. So security is still huge, and all of this you're seeing more and more happen in the last couple years or so around security focus with respect to education in Kubernetes. So absolutely, it's not going anywhere anytime soon, and security is everyone's responsibility, and that goes for Kubernetes as well.
And a survey that I read recently said that one of the biggest issues in security in Kubernetes is related to misconfiguration. And that may seem obvious, but I think a lot of people in their minds consider those two different things. Well, I'll run my pen testing program, and then we'll be fine. But no, if you're actually configuring things poorly, it's leaving holes for a nefarious actor to get in there and do bad things on the security side. So, yeah, and there's a lot of tools in this space. There's a lot of open source tools in this space. Again, Fairwinds Insights does play in the Kubernetes security space. It pulls in a number of open source security tools, as well as some of our own, to help you get that balance right. But there's lots of tools in this space. So next question, and if you have more questions, please feel free to keep them coming in. We've got a few more. So are you competing with OpenShift, Rancher, etc.? So the short answer is, as Fairwinds, we're not really competing with those. Rancher is a way to stand up clusters really easily. You click a couple buttons in a GUI. You have a repeatable way to do that. Rancher is a great tool. Rancher is really competing with GKE, EKS, AKS, those kinds of things. We are not doing that because we're just leveraging vanilla Kubernetes. We're not building a tool to overlay on top of it. You could say that we're a little bit competing with OpenShift. OpenShift is an opinionated distribution of Kubernetes. I think it's it's Red Hat taking the Linux model where they shipped Red Hat Enterprise Linux and saying, hey, let's do the same thing with Kubernetes. Let's package up Kubernetes with a whole bunch of things and make our distribution of it. And it ends up being different from vanilla Kubernetes. And what's different about Kubernetes from Linux is there isn't really vanilla Linux. The kernel is vanilla, but the way that it's wrapped is always basically in a distribution. And with Kubernetes, that's not the case. There is wide adoption of the vanilla project, and everything that we do is leveraging just Kubernetes itself. It's not OpenShift. It's not some proprietary thing. We are going to help you with open source add-ons. Everything that Fairwinds does is the same thing that you'd get if you hired a team of 10 very senior Kubernetes engineers. It's just going to take them a long time to build what we've built because we have a bunch of automation around it. So you can go hire internally. You can get the same thing. You can build it yourself. You can eventually get to the same place, or you can leverage someone like us to build those things quickly in an automated way, in an opinionated way, and manage it long term, if that makes sense. Okay, another question we have. You mentioned availability zones in the cloud. What options are there for separating pods in a data center? And I think you touched on this a little bit, Ivan, but do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I mostly alluded to how this can work, but I'll say a little bit more about it. So in a data center, well, in cloud, when you have a cloud provider installed in Kubernetes, which happens automatically for cloud managed Kubernetes, or you do it yourself if you're going to install on top of like EC2 instances or Google Compute. One of the things that cloud provider gives you is some automatic labels. Think of them like tags that get added to your nodes, and that's going to represent primarily the availability zone, which you might think of like that failure domain that we mentioned, or the region, which you might think of, as like, Portland area versus, California area kind of thing. So in a data center, you don't get those automatic labels because there's no way of carving up your nodes in terms of racks or failure domain from a network perspective, or cooling, or this pod of racks is on this generator and that pod's on another generator, that kind of thing. But you can apply labels as part of your Kubernetes process to node pools or to nodes within a pool. And so you would still want to, as part of your provisioning process on-premise, have labels on your nodes that represent whatever availability zone like equivalent you're doing in your data center. So that's the answer there. In terms of how you propagate those labels, that's going to depend somewhat on what tooling you're using to provision, and if you have auto scaling or not. You might need to have some somewhat fancy discovery happening depending on how your hardware is provisioned, or if you're using VMs, you can have a little bit of discovery there for things like VMware. So.
Great. Is there anything we're missing here, Ivan, that we should have covered on the topic of configuration? Where to find help?
Yeah, I saw another.
Go for it.
I saw another question that was are there any other examples you could give of important factors on that first section that we talked about related to important configuration things. There's a lot we could talk about here. I'll talk a little bit more about a few pieces real quickly, as we're pretty close to end of time. You want your control plane, which are the nodes in your cluster that run things like the API server, the scheduler, et cetera. You want that to be highly available as well. We alluded to that. Some of the reasons behind that are that you want your Kubernetes API, the thing that you talk. Ooh, slow network connection. Cool.
Oh, we got you. We can hear you, so keep going.
You want that control plane to be highly available, so that the API is not interrupted when you're doing your cluster upgrades, because things in the cluster talk to the API as well, not just you as a user of Kubernetes. Monitoring agents, we happen to use Datadog, that talks to the cluster as well to interrogate information about the pods running in your cluster and the status and the health of your nodes and that kind of things. Your CI, your continuous integration and delivery, also talk to the API as well. Another factor, real quick, and I'll wrap up, is you want to consider, when you're configuring your cluster, your egress from your cluster to the internet and to other cloud resources. So you may need to configure that network layer so that you have known public IP addresses that your cluster will communicate outbound. That might be necessary if you're talking to other cloud services that might need to add those known IPs to their allow list, for example. And you may want network address translation in between, and you may want your nodes to have their own individual public IPs, depending on what kind of controls your workloads are subject to, what kind of data you might be dealing with in your cluster. So that's another factor that is a little more painful to change later. You want to get that right as you're building the network out for your cluster.
All right. Well, thanks, Ivan. If you have any questions, please look us up. On Twitter, we are Fairwinds Ops. On GitHub, also Fairwinds Ops, and feel free to reach out. We probably have something that helps solve a problem for you, and we'd be happy to talk with you. So we're out of time here, and I'm going to turn back over to Gary for a drawing.
Awesome.
Well, I mean, thanks so much to Kendall and Ivan. That was incredibly interesting. In addition to learning about leading edge Kubernetes practices, I think many of us are going to take some of your remodeling advice to heart and do a better job. So thanks for doing that. As you mentioned, we have 4 lucky winners for today's Amazon gift card giveaways. The winners are Darren D, Emmeline S, Valerie D, and Eugene C. Someone from the DevOps team will send you an email to confirm your email address and get the gift cards right over to you. As I mentioned, this webinar was recorded and the slides will be available to you on demand at devops.com in a couple of hours. And we'll be sending you a link to the slides and the recording as well. It was such a pleasure spending an hour of your time with us, and we truly appreciate that. We look forward to seeing you on the next devops.com webinar. In the meantime, stay safe and be well.